The heart monitor beeped softly beside my hospital bed, each sound reminding me that my heart had almost given up on me, and that I was still here by some stubborn miracle. I was 78 years old, fragile in ways I had never been before, wrapped in stiff white sheets that smelled of disinfectant and fear. My chest still burned from the heart attack, a deep aching pressure that whispered how close I had come to dying alone in that room. I stared at the ceiling, thinking about all the years I had lived, all the sacrifices I had made, and how strangely quiet everything felt when you realize your life might end without warning. That was when the door opened, and everything I believed about family cracked apart. Before I tell you what happened next, take a second to subscribe, because stories like this are not just entertainment. They are warnings, lessons, and sometimes the only voice people like me get after being silenced for decades. If you have ever wondered how love can turn into greed in a single heartbeat, you will want to hear every word of this. My name is Amelia. I raised my daughter with calloused hands and sleepless nights, after my husband died young and left me with more responsibility than money. I worked 2 jobs, skipped meals, and learned how to stretch hope thinner than it should ever go. I told myself it was worth it because family was supposed to mean loyalty. Family was supposed to mean showing up when things were ugly, not just when there was something to gain. Lying there in that hospital bed, I still believed that, even after the doctor had told me I was lucky to be alive. When my daughter finally walked in, I felt a flicker of relief. She looked older than I remembered, sharper somehow, dressed neatly, as if she were going to a meeting, instead of visiting her mother who had nearly died. Behind her was her husband, expression carefully neutral, eyes already scanning the room like he was assessing value instead of concern. And then I noticed the third person, a man in a dark suit, carrying a briefcase, standing slightly behind them, like he didn't want to interrupt, but very much wanted to be there. My stomach tightened in a way that had nothing to do with my heart. They smiled, the kind of smiles that don't reach the eyes. My daughter leaned forward and asked how I was feeling, her voice soft, practiced, almost rehearsed. I answered politely, because that is what mothers do, even when something feels wrong. The suited man remained silent, nodding once, as if acknowledging my existence, rather than caring about it. I knew then, in my bones, that this was not a visit born of worry. This was a transaction waiting to happen. I asked who he was, already knowing the answer. My daughter hesitated for half a second, too long. She said he was an attorney, that he was just there to help with some paperwork, nothing serious, nothing urgent. Her husband avoided my eyes completely. The heart monitor picked up my pulse climbing, and I could hear it echoing in my ears. In that moment, clarity hit me, harder than the heart attack ever had. They were not here because I almost died. They were here because I almost died and might not recover next time. I felt anger rise slowly, steady and cold. Not the explosive kind, but the kind that sharpens your thoughts. I remembered every birthday I spent alone because I was working. Every school event I attended with tired eyes because quitting was never an option. Every dollar I saved instead of spending on myself so that my daughter would have more than I did. And here she was, standing over my hospital bed, calculating the future without me in it. I told them calmly that if they were here to discuss my will, they could leave. The room went silent. My daughter's face tightened, her smile disappearing like it had never existed. She tried to argue, saying they were just being responsible, that it was better to handle these things early. The attorney shifted his weight, suddenly uncomfortable, as if he hadn't expected me to be awake, alert, and aware. I laughed, a dry, painful sound that surprised even me. I told them the truth. I said, "You are not here to see if I am alive. You are here to see what you get if I die." I said, "Get lost." I said I would change my will before I ever let greed be the last thing I saw in my child's eyes. My voice shook, but my resolve did not. Nurses peeked in from the hallway, sensing tension, but I did not care. This was my moment of survival, and I refused to waste it on politeness. They left without another word, the attorney following awkwardly behind them, his briefcase still closed. As the door shut, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Not because they were gone, but because I had finally seen the truth without excuses. Lying there alone again, heart still weak, but mind painfully clear. I made a decision that would change everything. I was not done yet. I was still breathing. And before my heart stopped for good, I would make sure betrayal came with consequences. Those quiet beeps beside my bed no longer sounded like a countdown. They sounded like a warning bell for anyone who thought I was finished. I closed my eyes and pictured a future where my choices finally mattered, where my legacy would speak louder than my silence ever had. Revenge, I realized, does not always roar. Sometimes it waits patiently, signed in ink, and delivered when people least expect it, when they are certain they have already won. That certainty would be their mistake, and I would make sure they remembered it forever. Very soon. The night after they left, sleep refused to come. Machines hummed, carts rolled past, and somewhere down the hall, someone cried into a pillow. But my mind was louder than all of it. I replayed my daughter's hesitation, the way her husband's eyes measured the room, the attorney's silence. I had survived the heart attack, yet something else had died right there in that bed, something naive and tender I had carried for years. I pressed the call button and asked the nurse for water, more to feel in control than from thirst. And when she left, I stared at my hands. They looked smaller than I remembered, veins raised like thin blue ropes, proof of time I could no longer bargain with. The doctor came early the next morning, serious but kind, explaining recovery, medications, risks. He said stress was dangerous now, that I needed peace. I smiled and thanked him, knowing peace would come later, after I set things right. When he left, I asked the nurse for my purse. She hesitated, hospital rules and all, but I insisted. Inside was my old phone and a folded piece of paper with numbers written in my careful script. One of those numbers belonged to a woman I trusted, someone who had watched me build my life brick by brick and never once tried to take credit for it. Her name was Evelyn. She had been my neighbor for 20 years, a retired paralegal with sharp eyes and a sharper memory. I called her, my voice low, steady, and told her everything. She did not gasp or scold. She listened. When I finished, she said something that made me smile for the first time since the attack. She said, "Amelia, if they showed up with a lawyer, then you need one who actually cares about you." She promised to come by that afternoon. While I waited, memories flooded in. I remembered signing my original will years ago, back when I still believed love was permanent and gratitude automatic. I had divided things fairly, thinking fairness would protect me. The house, the savings, the small investments I had made quietly over decades, all neatly allocated to family because that was what mothers did. I wondered how long my daughter had known about it, how long she had planned that hospital visit. The thought hurt, but it also hardened me. Evelyn arrived with a notebook and calm confidence. She sat beside my bed and asked precise questions, never rushing, never assuming. She told me my feelings were valid, that what had happened was a betrayal, not a misunderstanding. Then she explained my options. I could change everything. I could place conditions. I could redirect my legacy entirely. Listening to her felt like oxygen. For the first time, I wasn't reacting. I was planning. We talked about the people who had actually shown up for me over the years. The nurse who held my hand when the pain peaked. The community center where I volunteered after retirement. Feeding people who thanked me with sincerity, not expectation. A young woman there named Rosa, struggling through nursing school, who had driven me to appointments when my car broke down and never asked for a cent. These were the people who knew my worth when there was nothing to gain. When my daughter called later that day, I let it ring. Then I let it ring again. I imagined her frustration, the way she hated not being in control. Eventually, I answered. She tried to sound concerned, asking how I was feeling, saying the visit had been misunderstood. I listened quietly, then told her I was resting and would talk another time. I did not argue. I did not explain. The silence unsettled her more than anger ever could. Over the next few days, my strength slowly returned. Each step with physical therapist felt like a small victory. Each breath without pain felt borrowed and precious. And in that clarity, I made choices. Evelyn coordinated with an attorney she trusted, someone who agreed to meet me privately in the hospital. Papers were drafted, reviewed, revised. My signature trembled, but my intent did not. I placed protections where there had been blind trust. I redirected generosity toward those who had shown compassion without contracts. The day I was discharged, my daughter and her husband waited in the lobby. I saw them before they saw me, standing stiffly near the elevator, rehearsing words they thought would fix everything. I walked past them with my walker, nodded politely, and kept going. My daughter called my name, but I did not stop. The power in that moment surprised me. It was not cruelty. It was clarity. At home, I rested in my own bed, sunlight warming the room, and felt something close to peace. I knew the storm was coming. I knew questions would be asked, accusations made. But I also knew something else. I had survived not just a heart attack, but an awakening. And when the time came, when the ink dried and the truth was revealed, my daughter would learn what it meant to mistake patience for weakness. My heart might have faltered, but my resolve was stronger than it had ever been. And that resolve was already set in motion, waiting for the moment it would finally speak for me. That night, I opened the old photo album and traced faces with my finger, realizing legacy was not blood, but behavior repeated over time. I slept deeply, unafraid, certain that consequences were not cruelty, but balance restored. Tomorrow would bring calls, demands, perhaps tears, yet none of it could rewrite what was already done. The documents existed, the witnesses existed, and somewhere inside my chest, beneath feeling muscle, a quiet strength settled in, patient and immovable, ready for whatever came next, without apology or regret. I welcomed the future calmly, knowing truth, time, and law would finish what honesty had finally begun. For me alone. The calls started the very next morning. I knew they would. My phone buzzed on the bedside table while sunlight crept across the curtains, and I let it buzz until it stopped. Then it buzzed again, and again. Messages followed, each one shifting in tone from concern to irritation. from irritation to something sharper. I read none of them at first. I made tea, sat by the window, and watched birds hop along the fence like the world had not tilted on its axis. That normalcy felt grounding. It reminded me that chaos only exists where you allow it. By the third day, I answered. My daughter's voice came through tight and controlled, like a wire pulled too far. She asked why I was ignoring her, accused me of punishing her when all she had done was try to help. I let her speak. I noticed how quickly help turned into entitlement when it went unanswered. When she finally paused, waiting for reassurance, I told her calmly that I needed time and space. I said my health came first now. She laughed, a short sound, and said family should come first. I replied that family shows up with love, not paperwork. Then I ended the call. Her husband called next. His approach was different. Softer. He spoke about misunderstandings, about stress, about how hospitals make people emotional. He suggested we all meet and clear the air. I declined. I told him decisions had already been made. The silence on the other end was thick, followed by a clipped goodbye. I could almost see his jaw tightening, calculations shifting. That image no longer frightened me. It confirmed I was right. Evelyn visited that afternoon, bringing groceries and updates. She told me the attorney had finalized everything, that copies were secured, that my wishes were clear and legally solid. She did not smile when she said it, but her eyes were bright with something like pride. She reminded me to take my medication, to rest, to protect my heart, not just physically, but emotionally. I promised I would. After she left, I sat with the weight of what I had done. It was not light. It was not easy. But it was necessary. Word traveled faster than I expected. A cousin called, asking vague questions about my health and my plans. An old friend hinted that my daughter was upset, telling people I was being manipulated. That one stung, not because it was true, but because it revealed how quickly she had chosen a narrative that painted her as a victim. I realized then that no matter what I did, she would justify herself. That freed me. You stop trying to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding you. A week later, they showed up unannounced. I saw their car pull into the driveway and felt my chest tighten, but not with fear, with resolve. I opened the door before they knocked. My daughter looked surprised, then relieved, as if this was the opening scene she had imagined, where emotion would soften me. Her husband stood behind her, hands in pockets, eyes scanning again. No attorney this time. That was new. They asked to come in. I said no. I told them we could talk right there on the porch. Neighbors watered plants and pretended not to listen. My daughter's eyes filled with tears, sudden and dramatic. She said she loved me, that she was scared of losing me, that she didn't mean it the way I took it. I listened. I really did. Then I asked one question. I asked why, if love was the reason, the lawyer had come before the flowers. Her tears stopped. Just like that, her husband stepped in, frustration leaking through his calm mask. He said I was being unfair, that they had rights, that families plan these things. I corrected him. I said inheritances are gifts, not rights. I said the only thing children are owed is honesty, and even that goes both ways. My daughter's face hardened. She accused me of choosing strangers over blood. I nodded and said I was choosing respect over entitlement. They left angry, not sad, not reflective, angry. As their car disappeared down the street, I felt a strange mix of grief and relief. Grief for the relationship I had thought we had. Relief that the pretending was finally over. Inside, I sat at the table and cried, quietly, without shame. Strength does not mean absence of pain. It means moving forward despite it. That evening, Rosa came by after her shift. She brought soup and awkward concern, unsure how much to say. I thanked her and told her she didn't need to fix anything. We talked about her classes, her dreams. She listened when I spoke, really listened, without checking her phone or steering the conversation back to herself. When she left, she hugged me gently, careful of my healing body. That hug meant more than any promise my daughter had ever made. Lying in bed later, I thought about legacy again. About what remains when we are gone. It isn't money. Money moves. It changes hands and meanings. What remains is the story people tell about you when you are not in the room. I knew what story my daughter would tell. And I knew what story others would tell too. I accepted both. The next step would be public. It would be irreversible, and it would hurt them more than any argument ever could. I did not rush it. Revenge, when done right, is not loud. It is precise. It waits until the other side is certain nothing has changed. And then it changes everything. I slept that night with a calm certainty, knowing the final act was coming, and when it did, it would leave no room for doubt about who truly mattered in my life and who never had. 2 weeks passed before the invitation arrived. Cream paper, elegant lettering, my daughter's handwriting unmistakable. She invited me to a small family gathering, said it was meant to celebrate my recovery, said everyone missed me. I held the card for a long time, weighing it in my hand like it carried more than paper. I knew what it was. A test. A stage. They wanted to see where they stood, how much control they still had. I smiled to myself and decided I would go, not because I owed them comfort, but because I was ready. I arrived early, cane tapping lightly against the polished floor of my sister's living room. Conversations hushed for a moment when people noticed me, then resumed in forced cheer. Hugs followed, gentle and cautious, as if I might shatter. My daughter approached last, her smile carefully rebuilt, her voice warm enough to convince anyone watching that all was forgiven. She asked if I was feeling better. I told her I was feeling clearer. The difference mattered. Wine was poured, plates filled, stories shared. I listened more than I spoke. I noticed how often my daughter's husband watched me, like he was waiting for a signal. I noticed how frequently inheritance was mentioned casually, wrapped in jokes and nostalgia. Remember when Grandma promised this? Remember when Amelia said that? Each reference felt like a small probe, testing for weakness. I gave them nothing. Halfway through the evening, my daughter raised her glass and tapped it gently, calling for attention. She spoke about family, about resilience, about how close we had come to losing each other. Her voice wavered at just the right moments. People nodded. Some wiped tears. She thanked everyone for being there, then turned to me and said she was grateful I was still with them. Applause followed. I waited for it to die down. When it did, I stood slowly, the room falling quiet again. I thanked her for the kind words. I said surviving the heart attack had changed me. I said it had reminded me how fragile life is, and how important it is to be honest while we still can. I felt Evelyn's eyes on me from across the room, steady and encouraging. I took a breath and continued. I said I had spent a lot of time thinking about legacy, about what we leave behind and why. I said I had updated my will. The air shifted instantly. Forks paused mid-air. My daughter's smile froze. I did not look at her. I addressed the room. I explained that my estate would be going to people and causes that had supported me without expectation, that had shown up in my life when there was nothing to gain. I said this was not punishment. It was alignment. My daughter interrupted me, laughing nervously, saying this wasn't the time. I looked at her then, really looked. I said the time was now, because secrets rot families faster than truth ever could. I said she had come to my hospital bed with a lawyer instead of comfort, and that choice had consequences. Gasps rippled through the room. Her husband stood abruptly, face flushed, denying it, calling it a misunderstanding. I nodded and said misunderstandings don't carry briefcases. Silence fell heavy and absolute. I could hear my own heart beating, strong and steady. I said I loved my daughter, but love does not mean enabling greed. I said my decision was final, legally binding, and already in effect. I said I hoped one day she would understand that this was not revenge, but boundaries enforced at last. Then I sat down. Chaos followed. Voices rose, my daughter cried. Real tears this time, accusing me of humiliating her. Someone tried to smooth things over. Someone else whispered that maybe I had gone too far. I listened to none of it. I had said what needed to be said. When I stood to leave, no one stopped me. They watched, stunned, as I walked out. Outside, the night air was cool and grounding. Evelyn waited in her car, engine running. She asked if I was okay. I nodded. My hands were shaking, but my chest felt light. I realized then that revenge was not the moment itself, but the peace that followed. It was knowing I had taken control of my story before someone else rewrote it for me. In the days that followed, messages poured in, some angry, some pleading, some supportive. I responded to none of them. I volunteered again at the community center, feeling more welcome than ever. Rosa passed her exams and cried in my arms when she told me. I funded a scholarship in my late husband's name. Life moved forward, richer and quieter. One afternoon, a letter arrived from my daughter. It was long, defensive, painful to read. She said I had chosen strangers over family. She said I had broken her trust. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. Some truths do not need replies. They stand on their own. As my strength returned, so did my joy. I gardened, I laughed, I slept deeply. The heart attack had nearly ended my life, but it had also saved it. I no longer lived in fear of displeasing others. I lived in alignment with myself. And somewhere behind me, I knew my daughter was learning a lesson she had never expected to face. That love is not inherited, it is earned. And when it is replaced with entitlement, it can disappear just as quickly as it arrived. I did not wish her harm. I wished her growth. Whether she chose it was no longer my responsibility. My legacy was set. My revenge complete. Quiet, legal, and irreversible. Months passed. Real months. The kind that test whether decisions were made from impulse or truth. The kind where anger fades and only consequences remain. I noticed something surprising during that time. No one who had criticized me ever showed up when things were ordinary. They didn't call to ask how my garden was doing. They didn't ask how my heart was healing. Their interest had always been tied to events, to money, to moments where something could be taken. That realization sealed everything for me. My daughter tried one last time, not directly, but through others. A distant aunt mentioned reconciliation. A cousin suggested mediation. Someone said life was too short for grudges. I smiled politely and changed the subject. What they called grudges were actually boundaries, and boundaries only upset people who benefited from you having none. Then the call came. My daughter's husband had lost his job. Investments had gone poorly. Bills were stacking up. Suddenly, urgency replaced pride. My phone rang late one evening, and when I answered, her voice was small, not apologetic, desperate. She said they were struggling. She said family helps family. She said she hoped I hadn't forgotten that. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I said something that surprised even me with how calm it sounded. I said I remembered exactly who my family was when I lay in that hospital bed, wondering if I would wake up again. I said I hoped things improved for her. And then I wished her well and ended the call. I did not cry afterward. I did not feel guilt. I felt closure. Weeks later, Evelyn told me the scholarship fund had helped its first recipient, a young woman who reminded me so much of myself, it hurt in a good way. Rosa graduated and got her first job at the hospital where I'd nearly died. She hugged me in the hallway and said she hoped she could be even half the woman I was one day. I told her she already was. One afternoon, while organizing old papers, I found a copy of my original will. The one written back, when love felt safe and unquestioned. I read it slowly, not with regret, but with understanding. That version of me did the best she could with what she believed then. This version had simply learned more. The rumors eventually died down. People grew bored. There was no drama left to feed on because I refused to participate. My daughter stopped calling. Her husband never tried again. The distance became permanent, not with a fight, but with acceptance. Sometimes endings are quiet. Those are the ones that last. On the anniversary of my heart attack, I returned to the hospital, not as a patient, but as a donor. I funded new equipment for the cardiac wing. I met nurses who thanked me with tears in their eyes. One of them said my gift would save lives. I thought about how close I had come to losing mine, and how strange it was that nearly dying had finally taught me how to live. That night, I sat on my porch with a blanket around my shoulders, watching the sun disappear behind the trees. My heart beat steadily, faithfully. I thought about my daughter, somewhere out there, telling her own version of the story. I no longer cared how it sounded. Truth doesn't need defending when your life reflects it. I realized then that revenge was never about hurting them. It was about refusing to let them hurt me again. It was about choosing dignity over desperation, clarity over denial. The will was just paper. The real change had already happened inside me. If I die tomorrow, I will die knowing my life meant something beyond what I owned. I will die knowing my final act taught a lesson more powerful than inheritance ever could. And if my daughter one day understands that love cannot survive where greed lives, then perhaps something good will still come from all of this. Until then, I live peacefully, fully, without fear. I was dying in a hospital bed when they came to claim what they thought was theirs. I walked out of that bed, owning myself instead. The final confirmation came on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that once would have passed without meaning. I was trimming roses when Evelyn's car pulled into the driveway. She stepped out slowly, smiling before she even reached the porch. I knew that smile. It meant everything was finished, not in progress, not pending. Finished. She handed me a sealed envelope and said, quietly, "It's done. All filings finalized. All notifications legally delivered. No room for disputes. No loopholes. No appeals that could touch you." Her voice carried certainty, the kind built on experience and ink and signatures that do not fade. I opened the envelope at the kitchen table. Inside were copies of the final confirmations, stamped, dated, unquestionable. My estate, my savings, my home, my legacy, redirected exactly as I had chosen. Charities, scholarships, trusts, people who had shown up without expecting anything in return. My daughter's name appeared only once, attached to a clause stating she had been intentionally excluded. Not forgotten, not overlooked, intentionally excluded. That sentence mattered more than any amount of money ever could. Evelyn poured tea while I read. She didn't speak, didn't interrupt the moment. When I finished, I folded the papers carefully and placed them back in the envelope. I felt no rush of triumph, no gloating, just a deep, steady calm, like setting down a burden I had been carrying for years without realizing it. The reaction was immediate. My daughter called within hours of receiving her notice. This time, there was no pretense, no softness, no careful phrasing. She screamed. She accused me of cruelty, of betrayal, of destroying the family. She said I would die alone. She said I would regret this with my last breath. I waited until she ran out of words. Then I told her the truth, one final time. I said I almost died surrounded by strangers, and the only thing she brought into that room was a lawyer. I said love does not arrive with conditions. I said inheritance is not payment for being born. I said if she ever wanted a relationship again, it would have to be built on respect, not expectation. And then I ended the call. I blocked the number. I did not hesitate. There were messages after that. Emails. Letters. Even a knock on the door one evening that I chose not to answer. Eventually, it stopped. People grow tired when there is nothing left to take. Life settled into something quieter than I had ever known. I woke without dread. I slept without replaying conversations in my head. My heart grew stronger, not just physically, but emotionally. The weight of obligation lifted, replaced by choice. On my 81st birthday, the community center held a small celebration. Nothing extravagant. Cake. Laughter. A handmade card signed by people whose lives I had touched in ways I never measured before. Rosa gave a speech, her voice shaking, thanking me for believing in her when no one else had. I cried openly then, surrounded by people who loved me for who I was, not what I owned. That night, alone in my house, I walked from room to room, touching the walls, the furniture, the life I had built. I thought about how close it all came to ending in bitterness. How easily I could have stayed silent, polite, accommodating, and died with my generosity turned into entitlement by others. Instead, I chose something harder. I chose myself. I wrote one last letter, not to my daughter, to myself. I wrote that I was proud, that I had finally honored my own worth, that love given freely is beautiful, but love demanded is poison. I placed the letter in my bedside drawer and slept peacefully. If this story reaches anyone who feels trapped by guilt, by blood, by the expectation to give endlessly just because you always have, hear this clearly. You are allowed to change your mind. You are allowed to protect yourself. You are allowed to decide who benefits from your life. I was dying when they came to claim what they thought was theirs. I lived long enough to make sure they never did.